All right. Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Heromakers podcast, season 3. And we are now in March, which, Anne, I have to tell you, it's International Women's Day. So,
Yay!
yeah, happy International Women's Day. That's you. And I'm going to call you that because you're up in Prince Edward's Island. So to me, you're international because you're not in the United States right now. So
that's right.
And tell people what you're doing in Prince Edward's. Is it plural or is it singular? Edward.
Singular. Prince Edward Island. Yes.
After
so
Prince.
I'm actually visiting a friend of mine who lives in New Brunswick, which is part of the Maritimes here in Canada, and PEI is most known for Anne of Green Gables, Ellen Montgomery.
Yeah.
And so I've done my duty, and I've had clam chowder, lobster rolls, all the good food, and all the local beers.
Yeah.
So I'm doing a good job as a tourist. So I'm very happy.
You're helping the economy there, right?
Very happy to report. That's correct.
Good job, Anne.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Also, happy International Women's Day to you too, Laurie.
Oh, thanks.
And to you, to our guest as well.
And to our guest, Mannie, who's not a woman, but we're still going to celebrate it with Mannie because we are going to talk about important issues related to patriarchy and kind of all that good stuff. So it is actually, we didn't plan this, Mannie, just so you know, it just kind of happened. So.
The International Women's Day to the both of you.
Thank you.
And yeah, women.
And so I do want to welcome our guest to the podcast, Mannie Thomas. And Mannie, you are co-executive director and director of programming at this amazing organization called Success Stories. Is it actually an organization or is it a program? Is it an initiative? What do you guys call it out there?
So we are a nonprofit organization. We started off as a program that was developed by our co-founders, Richard Edmonds and Charles Berry at the Correctional Training Facility. And in 2019, we gained our nonprofit status.
Oh, great. Okay. And what I love about Success Stories, Mannie, is that people who are involved are either currently or formerly incarcerated. And I love that. And Mannie, and we had on, if you guys remember, season 1 of this podcast, we had on Hector Guadalupe. And Hector is out on the East Coast, and he was formerly incarcerated, and then he started something called Second You Foundation. And so now he's helping men, and I think women too, who are getting out of serving their time and getting them into jobs and doing kind of primarily through physical training and doing that kind of stuff. And I don't know if you saw this, Hector was actually nominated for a CNN Heroes Award.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know.
I didn't know that. I know. Nice. So I'm going to credit us for giving him the popularity, but I think that's false attribution.
That's right.
But we're going to go there anyways. So go back and listen to that episode if you guys haven't. But Mannie, Anne and I both love talking about these kind of issues, and just you like being a spokesperson, and just like we're really excited to hear your stories. And I have to say, Mannie, I was a little nervous about this conversation, and I'm gonna tell you why. It's because I was thinking about this, and I'm like, I think it's because I am an activator. I like to just go and do, and a lot of what you are doing through Success Stories and helping men kind of reframe their worldview of how they see themselves and women and others in order to lead to healthier lives and healthy society. You're gonna like clarify everything I just said about your organization.
Actually said wonderfully, right?
Oh, good. Oh, thank you. But a lot of what you guys are doing is kind of the hard work of the mind, and reframing our worldview and the thinking that needs to go before the action. And I think that's why I was a little nervous. I'm like, I am so prone to go from point A to point C and miss that point B in the middle that I think we all need to do. And so that's why I'm really excited to talk to you about just kind of the thinking that has gone into your own journey, and where you kind of what you're talking about in terms of patriarchy and what you've learned and what you're trying to teach these young men as well.
It's important because I think therefore I am is not just the saying. Like, we really have the ability to create our realities and how we show up in them simply by the way that we're thinking. And I figured that out relatively quickly in my transformation. And I think it had to start. It started with like ideas around paradigm shifts.
Yeah.
So in the beginning, if my thought process was no one's here to help me, I could not perceive those who were trying to help me. There would have been a bunch that I either would have like generalized it when people were trying to help me, or completely dismissed it, or rationalized why that isn't the case. And in the moment that I had my paradigm shift and I realized that there were plenty of people that were trying to help me, that the opportunities seemed like endless. They seemed endless. So what that told me was I was limiting myself and limiting access to information and to change by simply what I was thinking. And I was being made aware of an existence that I had created in my own mind.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so we got to talk a little bit about the lies that people tell themselves and the lies that we believe and how that impacts how we live. Okay, Mannie, start us out by telling us a little bit about your own journey, your growing up, and then kind of get us to the point where you yourself were incarcerated. And then we'll kind of go from there. So just give us some backstory on you.
I feel like there was a lot. I think it's important to start that very early on. I remember feeling as though I had no place of my own. So I grew up the youngest of four by a long shot. The sibling next to me was 8 years older than me.
Me too.
So yeah. So yeah. Are you the youngest?
I am, by 8, 10 to 12 years older, my siblings are.
Yeah, so the beginning stages when kids are trying to find like their own identity and sense of power and control, like I didn't have that autonomy in myself. It was somebody else dictating. So like I always tell the story about how when you have kids and they're around the same age, you kind of generally have the same interest, so they can watch either cartoons together or whatever. But when I wanted to watch cartoons, I got an older brother saying, I'm not watching that. I'm gonna either watch sports or I'm gonna watch that. So there was this idea of like, you don't decide for yourself what you're interested in, others will. And that kind of stuck with me. Now, of course, that wasn't done intentionally, but that was the feeling that had been generated for myself. So that was within the home. I grew up, like I said, in Corona, California, where at the time, in the early 80s and even 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of people who looked like me. So I think I was the only person of color, or, I was only Black kid in my class till probably junior high. So of course at school, here it is again, where it's just like, listen, you're like the supporting cast, right? Like you don't have the attention, you don't have the rights, you don't have this, you don't have all the other things that the main characters have, right? You're basically, it feels like you're here, but you're not here. And very early on, I figured out that changed with acts of violence. So there was a time I was in 3rd grade, and there was a older kid who was teasing a young girl at lunch, and I basically like pushed him. And of course, kids, and there's the whole, and you get the attention, and it was amplified by the fact that I was 2 grades lower than this kid. Long story short, we ended up staying after school. We get into a fight, I quote unquote. If there's at the time, there was a belief that there was winners and losers in fighting, and I won. And the attention that I got wasn't the attention that I normally got on a day-to-day. So it was kind of like, here's this tool that I can use that therefore gives me what I think I need in the attention that I wanted to. So although at that time fighting didn't become the absolute norm, it was one of those things that I would resort to if it was the only tool that I had left. By the time I got into junior high, it became a little bit more regular when kids started to find their social groups and stuff like that. And violence for me also showed up in other ways. I was always a smart kid. So I, like, mentally, I could always, I was always good at mental gymnastics. I was always good at verbal gymnastics. So I found out that I also could use violence in that way. I figured out that if I could outsmart you and make you look dumb in front of everybody else, that also was an advantage, right? And at the time, I didn't see that as acts of violence, but as I got older, of course, I figured out that you can be violent in a multitude of ways, and even without actually becoming violent, rather you become, boisterous, or even showing the willingness to become And the older and older as I got, the violence, would go from, fighting every once in a while to maybe fighting every couple of months, to where it was just the answer now to any time I felt insecure or vulnerable. And then eventually it escalated to the point where I used a firearm. I was, things happened at a party. I used a firearm, and it resulted in someone receiving serious bodily injury. Sorry, it's still kind of hard for me to talk about. Yeah, and the fact that I changed probably everybody's life at the party because they were victims of gun violence. So that's kind of how I got there. This idea that violence was my tool that I would use anytime that I was either feeling uncomfortable or less than. And there was an escalation of that, because I think it's important to say that anytime I actually tried to use anything else, it fell on deaf ears. So when there was a time in my life where I told people closest to me that I was feeling, I want to get the words right, emotionally deprived. I was made fun of for that. I was actually told, I told when I had the opportunity to be around a lot of people of color when we went back east and down south, and now it was a thing like, why you talk white? Like I've discussed like how I never felt like I had a place of my own, and it was almost one of those things that's just like, get your shit together, because as young men, that's what we're supposed to do, right? Like figure it out. You'll figure it out. So in the ways that I knew to ask for help, that wasn't heard. So I think that and what's weird is I think that it's important to also talk about is, even though that was my thought and my feeling, that doesn't mean that, like, for instance, in my household, I was clearly loved. My parents clearly loved me, right? So the behavior wasn't contributing to but because I was living in a world where that's where I was thinking and feeling, and I didn't have the tools to deal with the way that I was thinking and feeling. So then it resulted in me acting out in these maladaptive ways. So even if we have, I think, you always hear about kids that grow up in certain, well, they had all the resources that they needed, right? But if those resources, if they don't feel comfortable enough to ask for those resources and still maintain their social status, right? Then they're doing us no good. That's why, I mean, the best way I can kind of think about it was like normalizing how we normalize now the fact that we want people to reach out and to take care of their mental health, right?
Yeah.
When that was stigmatized and people weren't reaching out, there was a whole lot of things in our community that were happening.
Yeah.
But now that we're encouraging people that it's okay, take care of your mental health, seek counseling, do meditation, do all these other things. Like, now that we haven't stigmatized that, we make it okay and normalized for people to do that. Now you start to see the real change that's needed in our communities for people to heal.
Yeah.
And at that time, I wasn't feeling like that. And if we look at the state of our young men, we're not really creating communities where they feel like they can do that without losing their social status or being seen as less than or weak or being, referred to as derogatory terms and things like that. And that's what we're working to change.
Yeah. Mannie, as you're talking, I'm just hearing so many different elements that I think people could really resonate with in terms of expressing vulnerability, being their authentic self, wanting safe spaces where they could go to and feel loved, dealing with fear, like their internal sense of who they are. I don't know how much I've talked about this on the podcast, and I don't think I've talked about much, but so Mannie, my parents were great, right? So I would be one of those people that environmentally, it was great. I ended up developing a really bad eating disorder when I was in college that was terrible for 4 to 5 years. And so for me, my sense of kind of who am I and trying to figure this out, not feeling like I was good enough, not feeling like people could hear. It's like you're talking about the emotional part, you wanting to be seen. Like yours expressed itself in one way, mine expressed itself in hurting myself, and as a result hurting other people, right? Because all of our actions always hurt other people. Like when we have, or they impact people either for good or for bad, right? It either goes one way or the other. And I think that's when you're talking, I resonate really well with just if you don't have these healthy structures and healthy way of seeing yourself in the world, how quickly it can deteriorate. And Mannie, I don't know if you are seeing this with some of the men that you're working with, but I'm seeing it with like kids nowadays, even with just so many struggles with their mental health and with kind of who they are in the world, social media, it's like on a huge escalating scale right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
We're getting attacked from multiple angles now. The first thing I always say when I walk into a group and talk to a group of young folks is, the world that you grew up in is so much more like aggressive and like, because where we got it, maybe at home, maybe at school. Like when I left school, the school stuff stopped. The way that social media and stuff is now, that group of people or have access to your life all the time.
Yeah.
So it doesn't stop. And even like right now, you talked about the ways that you hurt yourself. There were other ways that I hurt myself and hurt others. But even in the things that are seen as healthy, if people are not feeling okay within themselves, what then happens, like I'll use football. Football for me was like heaven. Kept me in school. It was my release. It was one of the first it was the second place, because I started playing football when I was around 8 or 9, to where I realized, my skin color didn't matter, my socioeconomic upbringing didn't matter, my geographic, none of that mattered, right? We were all just football players. But what happened, because I didn't have that self-confidence, my identity was then tied with football. So then what happens is, if I'm not a football player, what am I? And then now the other maladaptive stuff came after that. Like when I stopped playing football in high school, now I lost that, right? Like now who am I as an individual? Because my identity was tied to that, because that's where it felt good and all these other things. So I think we need to be paying really close attention, especially to our young folks, to see, like, are they okay with just being themselves? Because if we haven't created an avenue for them to just be okay being themselves, even if they're not doing anything that looks like it could be quote unquote harmful, they might be identifying with things that are outside of them that at some point will change. Or, what if I would have got hurt and didn't have the ability to play football in high school? Like, we need to be looking at like those type of things. So it's really, really important for us to make sure that people have that confidence and that self-esteem, to the point where it's like we can get people just to the point like, I'm okay just being me.
Mannie, when we talked to Hector, I remember him saying that when he was actually finally arrested and locked up, that he said he slept. He's like, I just slept for the first few days, because we had asked him, so what was, the transition? He said once he had time away, like he just realized he was exhausted. And like, even as you're talking, I'm picturing you running, going, trying to kind of find love, find, acceptance, run. Okay. So then here you are, you get arrested. How old are you at this point?
I had just turned 22. It was 5 days after my 22nd birthday.
Okay. And then, walk us through then kind of that, and then where success stories entered the picture.
Incarceration. Hector said he slept. That's a strong individual. There was no sleep for me for a while. I haven't really talked about this often. So I got arrested the next morning. SWAT team came to my house. That was a terrifying experience. And they had already started to play like the mental games. Like they already, it starts that fast. So as soon as they had me handcuffed on the ground, with guns and a tank basically outside and helicopters flying over, they brought out a picture of my then girlfriend and were like, yeah, take a good look at her because you're never going to see her again. So they had already started. So, we live in a system where we like to think about like guilt and innocence and all that. For me, that was determined from the gate. So I had never been arrested before. So I went from my home being arrested to, I believe it was the Irvine Police Department. And they basically just set me in this concrete room for hours. Like, and at this point, nobody had told me anything. Like, I hadn't been told what I was arrested for, none of that. Although I knew, but they hadn't said, there was no communication. And they set me down there for hours. And then they came and did something procedurally that they're not supposed to do. They came and stripped me completely out naked, which they only typically do that in sex crimes. And they took pictures of me and stuff like that. But it was all a mental game at that point. Right? Like they were showing me that you have control over nothing. You are nothing. Like you will do what we say we do. Then they put me in a room. They act like they were going to ask me questions about what really happened. They didn't. And then they sent me back downstairs and they sent me to the county jail. And then when you go to the county jail, there's this thing that's called, they call it the loop, which is basically processing. And you basically go from like tank to tank with people that are at different stages of being processed or released. And typically you have people that are in there like kicking drugs, or, you know, you have people that are just coming in. And it's just like, it is by far the worst experience ever. And I think I was in the loop for like 22 hours.
Wow.
So at the end of that, before they send you upstairs, they put like 8 of you in the shower, they strip you guys out, do the whole, you know, bend over, cough and all that. And then you shower and then you go upstairs. And there's people can either be housed in 1-man cells, 2-man cells, 8-man cells, I think it is, 6 or 8-man cells, and or what they call a dorm, which in Orange County jail at the time, I believe was a 68-man dorm. So I got sent to a 68-man dorm, which was like, for someone who had never been to jail before, it was just chaos. Like it was just like, and it was the first realization where I was like, oh shit, excuse my language, like what have I done? Like where have I got myself? And I literally for the first, I would say probably 72 hours, I just sat up on my bunk and just watched everything. And then, like, you know, you have people asking, like, hey, where are you from? This and that. And they're doing the gel politic thing, trying to figure you out and all that. And then, and honestly, I think it was one of my saving graces was on the 3rd day, there was a riot between the Blacks and Hispanics. And I hate to say it, but it was the first time that I felt like, oh, I know what to do. Like I understood what my position was. So, you know, we got into a fight, they came in, pepper sprayed, and got us all down. And then lo and behold, the same way that violence has always done in my life, now I was getting positive reinforcement. Because before where it was like, I'm the weirdo who wasn't talking, wasn't, you know, I'm a young kid who wasn't gangbanging and none of that. It was like, oh, what's your name again? Like, where are you from? Like, you know what I mean? Because they had seen what I was able to do during the riot, I was then accepted. And that was the beginning of my jail experience. It was like, okay. And then it was really after that, I wasn't in any self-discovery part yet. Like, you know, I was reading my Bible and stuff like that, but not really committed to any type of true change. It was really just survival at that point. You were concerned about, okay, how you got very little sleep. I think you maybe sleep 2-3 hours if you're lucky. Wow. And it was just, you know, survival at that point. So that was the beginning of that's what county jail was like. When you get to prison, because of the age that I was and because the amount of time, and we didn't talk about the whole court process, but that's another trauma. If you have questions about that, I'll be willing to hear that. But when I got to the maximum security prison, due to not because of anything that I had done while I was incarcerated, but because of the amount of time that I had, that automatically like gave me enough points to go to the maximum security prison. And when I got to the maximum security prison, the prison that I got to at the time was on lockdown. And you literally could feel like the despair of the place. Like it literally like sat in the air. You can feel it. And what's weird is as you go down levels of prisons, you can feel how that lightens. But yeah, I had got to my cell. You're in classification for like 3 days, which is nothing. You're in there with somebody, but then they classify you, and then you go to where you're gonna be housed. And they moved me to where I was housed. And again, I was fortunate. They put me in the cell with somebody who used to be a gang member and no longer a gang member. And it ended up being a really like a source of so much knowledge when it came to like how to navigate prison, which was another saving grace that I had while I was there. But to show the level of violence, that we were on lockdown for probably 6 months when I got there. And then all of a sudden they're like, yard is where you get your recreational time. First time I had been to yard. So I'm getting dressed, all that. We go out. maximum security prison. They strip search you before you're able to go outside. So you go all the way down to your boxers, they search you, you go through a metal detector, then you go outside, you get dressed. So it was kind of one of those things where it's like, okay, again, let me find my place, even though I knew I didn't have one, but I was like, let me find my place. So I was in what they call the weight pile. I was working out. They were, older guys were kind of giving me the rules of the yards of what not to do, what you can do, where you can go, where you can't go, and all those type of things. And I remember, like, movement in prison is really important because movement in prison can notify you to what's happening. So like their posture began to shift and people started to look a certain way. And at first I had no idea what the hell was going on because I didn't know how to look for it in that way that they knew how to. And there was 2 Hispanic gentlemen stabbing another Hispanic gentleman on the yard, like what felt like to me forever. So when they were done, they literally, it's a white van. It backs up onto the yard. They put his body in the van. He goes back outside the yard. The minute the gate closes, they're like, resume, like nothing had ever happened.
Wow.
And I remember thinking to myself, oh, no one is here to help you. Like the guards aren't here to stop anything. No, none of the other, incarcerated folks that you're here with are going to, like, no one's here to help you. It's just you. So make sure. And it was a lesson that I carried with me for a long time about like the level of violence. So I started to try to find ways. One of the things that I noticed about myself when I was in that environment was when I was in the county jail, I was telling myself in a very arrogant way, if I'm being honest, that I was different than the people that I was around. I was telling myself, I was pointing out all the things that other people would point out. I grew up with both my parents in the household. I graduated from high school. I didn't have all these other things. Like I was telling myself that I was different. I had traveled. What's really scary about a lot of things is you meet people in there that have never left a 10-block radius. Like they've never left their neighborhood. It's like, wait, what? So I was telling myself I was different. But when I got to the maximum security prison, I remember there was another incident in the day room. And my thinking was I would have did the same thing. And I realized in that moment, like, you're not as different as you think you are. Like, if your reaction to that would have been the same thing, maybe you have more in common. So I think that's where the work started, because I was keenly aware in that moment that I wasn't the good guy that I was telling myself that I was, right? That when you spoke about the lies that we tell ourselves. I was telling myself I was a good guy. I just did this, one thing. People make mistakes, la la. Like that was the narrative that I was telling myself. Like, why would they do this to me? I don't deserve this, la la. And I began to realize, like, okay, if you're not this good guy, who are you? And how did you get to that point? Like, how did you get there? So I really started to like ground myself, and I made a decision. And I remember making the decision that I no longer wanted to be a taker. And not like a taker and stealing, not in that sense, but like I was taking from the people who love me the most, right? And I didn't want to do that anymore. And I wanted to give in a way, like, even if I was going to be in prison, like I wanted to be the son that my parents always told me that I could be. I wanted to be, a good brother. I wanted to be a good uncle. And I wanted to be a good example for even those that I was incarcerated with about what's possible if they decide to make change in their life. So on the level 4, that's when it started. When I got to the level 3, I had a huge self-esteem boost because I was able to then start getting involved in education. So I started taking college classes. And, first it was just, I'm taking college classes just to take them, just to have something to do, just to feed my brain and not let it atrophy. Because, just like if anything else, once I figured out the survival part of prison, my brain was on autopilot. And I was like, okay, I need to give myself something to do. And I started to do education. And then I remember I got my first AA. And it like reinvigorated me because it brought back a promise that I had made to my sister. My sister passed away when I was 16. She had lupus, and that sent me on a destructive path too. But she was a Stanford graduate. School was important to her. And she had always told me, like, make sure you stay in school, make sure you do these things. And I remember thinking of her when I got my first AA, and I was like, I want to do more. So I dove into that. Then after my third degree, the college that was offering programming at the prison I was at, they trained us to be like tutors and college and counselors so we can help the people that were there. And I remember feeling like, oh, even though I'm in prison, I can add value and I can change the environment that I'm at. And then I started to take self-help groups there, developed a couple self-help groups myself. And by that time, I had been in prison for almost 10 years. I think I had been in prison for like 9 years, and I had kind of accepted this idea that I might be in prison for the rest of my life. But I was like, if I am going to be in prison for the rest of my life, I'm going to change even this environment. So like that was the attitude I had. So by the time I got to the correctional training facility where I met a lot of my brothers that were in success stories, like it was already embedded in who I was to like be a part of these systems. So I was on the yard, we were working out, and it was like one of the first couple of times I had met Richie, because we had met actually through a poetry writing group that we were all a part of, and then we were having conversations, and then we became friends through another mutual friend of mine, my brother 88.
And Richie is the other co-founder. Is he the
Rich? Okay. Yeah, Richie Edmonds. He's the other co-founder. Richard Edmonds. We call him Richie.
Hey, before you move into that, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
I'm just picking up, like the things that when you said that you're emotionally deprived, I think you said, and then that feeling of lack of belonging, or like that community support, and then also other moments. I was just wondering, I think like what do you think about kind of like the definition of masculinity and what it means to be a man? Like, and I think you started to give some hope maybe when you're saying that it's actually more socially acceptable to like meditate and to actually be self-aware and stuff like that. So has that changed in your life? Yes, I think that's a yes. Would you mind helping?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it happened because of success story. So this is how I got introduced to success story. I was talking to Richie on the yard, and I had made a comment about one of his tattoos, and I said that it was like a hummingbird with like water, like a water drop or whatever. And I told him, I was like, bro, that tattoo's gay. And he basically looked at me and with no judgment, like no ridicule, he was just like, hey, bro, you ever thought about the way you use language furthers the oppression of other people? Yeah. And I was like, wait, like what? Like, come on, bro, it's not that serious. And he was like, no, just think about it. And he let it go. Like he didn't stay on it. He didn't do any of that. He just let it go. And then we were going to another class one day, and he was just like, hey, you think the way you view masculinity is holding you back from being a higher version of yourself? And when he asked me that, again, my fallback and arrogance, I was like, bro, cut it out. Like, I've been in prison for a very long time. I haven't been in trouble. I've created groups of my own. I got all these degrees. Like, I think I'm okay. But I'm also, when people tell me things, I go back and I think about it. And I was just like, I was curious. Like, so that's how I got into success stories. And, they had told me some of the bullet points about it, like patriarchy and all that. And at the time, my understanding of patriarchy was male leadership. And it wasn't until we started talking about masculinity and more importantly, toxic masculinity, when I started to be clear on that's not what we're talking about. So at the time, and what we've seen across the board was it was easy for us to define toxic masculinity in 4 points, right? Which is masculinity is typically measured by your ability to earn money as a man, right? The objectification of women, your willingness to be violent, or this idea that we have to be emotionless, right? And for men who don't adhere to those principles, they're normally deemed either not a man or gay or soft or whatever, right? And they're kept from the like boys club of what it is. And then for patriarchy is when society as a whole supports that. So my life prior to prison was exactly that, right? Like if I met something that made me feel comfortable or just wasn't right, I acted out in violence, right? Because I didn't have the ability to earn lots of money, or my family didn't have lots of money. I wasn't necessarily the ladies' man. And the emotionless part, as a young kid, I didn't have I wasn't as practiced in it yet, as you see some of our older patriarchs, right? Like you have, men that could be struggling and going through things, but they'll either, drink or, pull over on the side of the road and sit for 15 minutes before they come in the house. Like they're not actually verbalizing what's going on. And that's because we lose the ability to do that because it's like a muscle, right? Like we're not doing it. Men aren't talking about struggles and being open in ways that we can. So, you lose that muscle to have complex language, to express complex emotions, because society as a whole isn't saying that we support that type of masculinity. And thankfully those things are changing. So I think that when you ask me, after going through the first time with success stories and learning these concepts, and then seeing how systematically holding on to those belief systems and acting out like that contributes to either homophobia, transphobia, racism, our legal justice system, our treatment of like, when we're talking about like misogyny and all these different things, when you see how it leads to that, right? And quite frankly, in my own life, it made me understand the relationship between me and my father in a different way. Although we always had a pretty great relationship, but it understood the barriers that I felt like we had in our relationship became readily aware, because I now realized this system that I was being a part of that I never knew before. I think to me, that was when people say, like, what was the biggest aha moment? I didn't even realize I was playing into patriarchy. Didn't even know it existed. Didn't even know what it was. Like, I was just operating in this system because the world told me that this is how we're supposed to show up. And I was like, all right, it is what it is. It's how we do. Not realizing that not only was it keeping me from being the best version of myself, but it was keeping me from being the best community member that I could be as well. And the best family member, the best son. Like, it was keeping me, even though I was already in a good place, I've been able to add a depth to all my relationships simply because I now understand what happens when I don't have the permission to be my full emotional self, right? Because you're not fully human when we're not doing those things.
Mannie, can I ask you something? So as you're talking, like, this sounds exhausting to me. It's kind of having to address all these different issues, right? It sounds like mentally and emotionally exhausting to me. And it also sounds to me like these 4 parts that you laid out with the toxic masculinity, and then the broad system of patriarchy, right? Like that's kind of how, okay. So these 4 different components, I'm just going to touch upon the last one, which is the emotional part of it, because earning money, and I mean, that's, yeah. What was the key for you in shifting the way that you saw yourself as a man, as a person? Because I kind of think about people who maybe don't have safe places that they can be emotional, right? Like that was your upbringing. Like that role as the safe people, the safe spaces, like kind of be who you are. What is the key then? I mean, for people to like really want, for men to really want to go through this process, what do they need to have in place? Or for you, what was some of the helpful things that pulled you around? It sounds like you have a very strong learning capacity as well. Like you want to learn and grow, and that might be part of it. I'm just wondering how people get success, and what was key for you in all this?
I will say this: it's not as draining as it sounds. It's actually freeing. So my experience doing this for years now, and being part of multiple cohorts, is there's a huge sense of freedom when people start to realize they don't have to do this, because most of us are doing it and don't want to.
Yeah,
it's not what we want to do. We're trying to be what society says we have to be, and we'll play that part. And that's where you find, like, when people talk about like cognitive dissonance, that's where that's happening. Because and you see a lot in teenagers. There'll be kids that party and smoke weed and don't want to do either, but in order to be in the in crowd and have some type of social status, those are the things that they have to do. So, and that eventually catches up. That self-betrayal catches up, because again, how you talked about, you harmed yourself, I acted out, like there's a part of you that's suffering. So when we start to have the conversation that says, and we're giving people different template of what masculinity is, and we're giving people the freedom to say, you actually define what masculinity is for yourself, honoring the things that you're saying is most important to you. They're like,
it's like a big
and then there's
exhale.
that there's that
Yeah.
collective, because the lie that, that patriarchy tells us is that we're alone, right? Because we're not talking about it. So when they get into a space where they can talk about it, maybe air out some stuff that isn't good and they're not being judged for it, and they can just be their true honest selves, and they can see others who are having the same issues that didn't maybe grow up in the same area that they grew up in, but they were given the same rules, and they can see that camaraderie. It's just like, okay, now I can build a community that's helping me and that I could talk to, and that's going to support me in this new frame of thinking, just as I had people supporting me in a frame of thinking that was harming myself. Like, so you always want to, I think for me, it's not necessarily this idea of learning, even though I do enjoy learning, it's the idea of building a community to where when I am not at my best, I have somebody who can hold me accountable. Because human beings are not always going to be at their best. There's going to be times where I don't feel like I'm good enough as I am. I'm going to self-betray again, right? At some point, I'm going to lie to myself. But then if I've created a community that's just like, hey, nah, you good enough as you are. Like that feeling that you're having is justified. Let's feel through it. And then let's move on. Like, you know what I mean? When I'm having people who are encouraging me, because, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, unfortunately, we live in a system that thinks of solutions in a way that like we should not have problems, other than just recognizing that problems are a part of existence. So if these things are a part of existence, then it's just like, okay, no, this is supposed to be here, therefore we should have a solution to help. And that's where success story sees itself, right? Success stories is trying to be this example that we can give folks what they need while they're still in community, rather than isolating people and subjecting them to more harm. Because this idea that we just punish people for arbitrary amounts of time, send them away from their families, and probably from some of the only good examples or good influences that they have in their life, take them away from that, then somehow then bring them back to community and they're going to be better than when they left. Like, that's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. So you want to make sure that you can give people what they need in order for them to have true, behavior transformation. And quite frankly, we're all examples of that, right? Which is why success stories didn't stay in prison, right? We're now in junior high schools, we have youth organizations, we're going to have reentry homes and all these other things, is because, and then we're developing a curriculum that's for other gender identities so that women and other communities can go through it, because patriarchy doesn't still exist because only men are participating in it. We all are in some way, in some fashion or another. So the more that we can make ourselves aware of how we're participating in patriarchy, the better chance we have of dismantling it and seeing that we don't need it. Because patriarchy doesn't just feed how we view masculinity. It's the tool that we use for capitalism, which capitalism says we prioritize goods over people, right? Because we've then objectified people, which is a part of patriarchy. So like when we're saying, how does this then help us to create a more healed thing? It makes us aware of all these other things, right? It makes us aware of how patriarchy contributes to these heteronormative behaviors, and anything outside this heteronormative behavior is then demonized in a way, which is why we have homophobia, transphobia, and all that. It's why we have, it's how we devalue the work of women, so that we have misogyny and sexism and all these other things. It's how we contribute to racism because of the objectification of people. Said, hey, look, these people, because if we're honest too, and I think this is important to say, if we're looking at patriarchy, the biggest sufferers from patriarchy is for women of color and other feminine identified people of color. You know what I mean? They're because patriarchy creates a caste system, and they're the lowest on the totem pole, right? Because is what it says. So if we're going to create communities that are in any healed, meaningful type of way, we then first need to become aware, right? So that we can see how it affects us, and then think of new solutions and new ways that we can love one another without this idea of just casting people away. I think that's important.
So, okay. So Mannie, I have like 100 questions, but I know you're on a hard stop. So I'm going to ask one of them, hopefully we'll get to two, but talk to us about this quote that you used in success stories, which is love without disposability. What does that mean, to love without disposability?
Love without disposability means we can love our community members in a way that we don't just cast them aside or see them as irrelevant when mistakes are made, right? We understand that human beings are complex creatures. Most of the time when we're dealing with harm that's being caused, it's associated in trauma. often is caused by trauma that had nothing. There was a quote, and I forget where I seen it the other day, but it says, people's first experience with violence isn't them committing it. Like, you've been exposed to violence well before you committed it. Like, so you were probably a victim yourself before you made somebody else a victim. And I think that's important to hold. And I think it's important for us to be aware of the systems that cause harm, right? Because once we're aware of the systems that cause harm, we can treat that so that people are fed and have access to, home. They're homeless, they're fed, they have access to meaningful employment and all these other things. And we could start to do that, which will allow us to have, to live in a more equitable way for everyone.
Yeah. It feels like there's this element of being kind to yourself almost, right? And that was my second question, Mannie, was that I don't know if you've heard like the difference between shame and guilt, right? Where like guilt is good and healthy, shame holds you back. But I'm wondering, like, for people who have, harmed themselves, harmed others in the past, how do they get through kind of this feeling of shame? Like they are worthy of now changing things and finding redemption. What does it look like to work through wounds of the past?
It's difficult, but because I think that's shame and guilt and how we work through things that we've done in our past, I think are different for everybody because of how we associate with them. If I was going to say something that applied to everyone, though, is you have the right to be healed in that way. Like, if we understand that nobody's perfect, which means people are going to make mistakes, people are going to fall short, people are like, if we can get away from that idea, then it's just like, okay, well, look, I missed the mark there, but I have another opportunity to make it up. I can try harder. I can do all these other things. Like, people have the right to change and transform. And as human beings, that's what we do, right? We grow. You will not be, if I didn't get to the point where I realized I was more than the worst mistake I had ever made, where would I be now? Right? And there was a time, though, that I thought that. There was a time when they found me guilty and then I go to prison and they drop this folder that basically is everything they said in court. There was a time that I thought that I will only ever be known for the worst thing that I had ever done. But it was the people in my life that reminded me that I was more than the worst thing that I had ever done. And then there was people that came after that loved me in spite of the worst thing that I'd ever done. So they seen past all that, which then allowed me to become the person that I knew I could be.
I love that.
Awesome. And also be given the opportunity to have a second chance, and actually contribute, like you were saying, give back to the community. And that's why even that you live where you live, which is awesome, that you've stayed there.
Yeah. Well, Mannie, I hope that people heard like these different threads in your story one of them too, I hope people didn't miss, is that you were noticing things around you, right? Like you shared several moments of like, where you're like, okay, you wanted to change. Like you knew you wanted to live differently. Others weren't there to take care of you. Like something had to change. And that requires you to be aware. And I think that that's a good lesson for all of us is what do we need to be aware of around us, inside of us, around us, that can help us to grow and become the kind of authentic, vulnerable, real people who can love others well. And
I would also say this, like, it's important for me to say, like, these ideas aren't as like far-fetched as we think. Like, it's not a new thing. In fact, many of us do it, but we pick and choose where we do it, right? So, and even within the systems that we see at play in our community, like we see an officer who commits an atrocity, and it's just like, well, let's give them some time behind a desk and let's train them and then let's bring them back, right? We see family members who within our own families have done egregious things, and we're just like, oh well, let's give them an opportunity. Like, let's we keep those secrets within our own family, and we allow people to hopefully change. And what I'm saying is, we shouldn't be as selective with the idea of how people can transform in that way. Yeah. And that's not to have judgment on one another. I know that people will have judgment saying we shouldn't do that. But what we should do is love people enough to figure out, okay, how did they get there? Yeah. And what can we do as a community to make sure they don't do it again? They realize what they have done. They change their behavior, and then make sure that it doesn't happen. Like we have, as a community, we can do that, and we can find out what that is. And really, we have a duty to do so, because we can't live in this position where we keep seeing other people's problems as outside of ourselves. Because at the end of the day, it's just us. Yeah. And the minute I'm able to see parts of myself in everyone else, then I'm more committed to doing the things that we need to do in order to change their reality. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Mannie, I'm gonna close that with a phrase from my friend who she said, violence against her, like she's talking about women, is violence against us. So violence against another is violence against us. Like we're part of this global family. And so, Mannie, super grateful that you shared your story, and just thanks for all your wisdom and your honesty, and bless you. And we're thankful you guys joined us on the podcast here, and please share this around with others, give us 5-star rating and all that good stuff. And we'll see you guys next time.